There's a controversy currently surrounding Bryan Cranston. Now, if you don't know who Bryan Cranston is, first, have you been living under a rock for about 5 years? Second, Bryan Cranston is the dad in Malcolm in the Middle, and he played Walter, the main character in Breaking Bad. So the controversy surrounding Bryan Cranston is around this film that just came out called The Upside. In this film, it was a remake of a French film, and in this film, he played a quadriplegic millionaire. The controversy surrounding it goes kind of like this. People are saying that Bryan Cranston should not have taken this role. The logic behind this is that only a person with a disability only can play a disabled character, which means that if Bryan Cranston played this character, he was taking away a role from a disabled person. As someone who's deeply interested in creative things, I start to apply this to different ideas, and I've extended it and taken this idea and tried to apply it to different areas, and the question comes up in my mind, from a writer's perspective, can a white author write a black character? Can a man write a woman? Can a Westerner write a non-Westerner? Can we write outside our cultures? What about our social spheres? What about our families or even ourselves? My name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good. Welcome to How to Write Good, the writing podcast that is not about how to write. My name is Daniel Poppy, your host. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. If you haven't already, please follow How to Write Good on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you would like to stay up to date with both How to Write Good and everything I am working on, please sign up for my email list. You can find that at my website as well. Again, that's danielpoppy.com. One other thing you can check out is I have a serialized novel. It is out in both podcast and blog form right now. So every month there's going to be a new chapter. It is called One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. I think it's pretty cool. You should go check out the podcast because I know none of you read. So just go check out the podcast. I know you. I understand you. I know why you're listening to this. So with that, so next month is going to be a little different. I'm definitely going to have that story coming out. I'm going to have the next chapter coming out, but it may be too long and I may split it up into two parts. So you may get two parts next month, which I think is pretty cool. And I'm looking forward to having that out and getting more stuff out. So check that out. I think that's really great. It's a lot of fun. Like I've said in the past, do stuff, try stuff out. It's fun. The word of the week is adumbrate, and it does not sound how you would spell it generally. It's ADUMBRATE. So the ending sounds like how you'd spell it. And this word means to represent in an outline. You indicate faintly, or you foreshadow or symbolize. You can actually use this if you're just talking to someone and they want to know about a specific topic. You can say, oh, I'm going to tell you about it, and you can outline that topic, and you can use the word adumbrate. So there you go. You have a new word. Do I have the etymology? No, I don't have the etymology this week. I failed. All right, our accidental essence is one that is bordering on political, but it's not going to be political. People need breaks from politics. They need a lot of breaks from politics. They need about 23 hours of their day to be non-political, and then they can have 1 hour of their day being political. That's kind of how I see the world. I think that's how it should be. I don't like it when things get political that shouldn't be political. So I'm not going to try to politicize this, but at the beginning I talked about Bryan Cranston and I talked about this controversy with him. Now I'm going to get back to this controversy, but I'm going to get into it in a roundabout way. I'm not going to be addressing it directly, but it's a response to it. Just think of this podcast episode as a response to that controversy. So we are actually going to be talking about putting yourself in another's shoes from a creative perspective. And I hope that is something that helps you with your writing, but I hope that it's something that gets you thinking about how to view the world as well. Because I think a lot of things with creativity, a lot of it has to do with how you view the world. And I've heard quotes from other people who are very creative, and they have this idea that creativity, most of it isn't the material you're putting out. Most of it's actually how you're viewing the world, and then you can take that and translate it into whatever art form you like. So I have a friend, just to start off with this way, I have a friend who doesn't think you can understand other cultures, or at least that's what he told me. And if you're listening to this podcast, you know who you are. But he told me, we were talking, and he's like, I don't think that two cultures can completely understand each other. And I would agree, there is a space between cultures. Cultures do things differently than one another. But really, when you're talking about that, or when he's bringing up this idea, he isn't really saying that cultures don't understand each other, because cultures aren't a thing that can understand they can be understood, but they're not something that a person can something that can understand, right? Because a culture isn't sentient. A culture is made up of what people do and what people produce. Therefore, it's not something that can understand something else. Now, what he does mean is that two people from different cultures cannot understand one another completely because of that cultural divide, because he is seeing it as if there is a space between two cultures, right? Which I think that to a certain degree there is a space between two cultures. I think that if you're bringing two cultures together, there's often things that are misunderstood, and I think that's what he was commenting on. So I'd like to go into this idea a little bit because I think it's really applicable to what we're talking about today. If you break this down, really cultures are just looking at the world, and then we are creating lines between things. Cultures are similar to race. Races don't exist. Now, if you look at the genetics of someone, you can take that genetic code and you can say this is what this person looks like, and you can get down to really specific things about them. You could probably say, oh, this person is more likely to have cancer, and this person has this hair color, this person's nose is this width, etc. But with that, race doesn't really exist in the way that it's all on a spectrum, if that makes sense. So if you look at the races of the world, we say, oh, this person is this color, this person is that color. But you may have someone, and it's the case for a lot of people, that have two races mixed together, right? They have two sets of genetics, and one set of genetics has the person is from a person who has darker skin, and the other set of genetics is from a person who has light skin, who has blonde hair, right? And you put those together, and that person has both of those genetics. And the genetics, the phenotype, so the phenotype, if you can't remember from biology, is the expression on the outside of the person. The phenotype may look like something, but that those genetics of that person reflect both of those realities, that it's coming from a white person and a black person, as we would call it. And the reason why we actually talk about people in racial terms is really to categorize people, right? If you're looking at someone or you're trying to tell someone about somebody else, it's useful to be like, oh, you're painting a picture of that person, you're saying, well, they're black or their skin's like this. Authors do this all the time when they're describing characters. They attribute specific characteristics to a character to paint a picture of who the character is, to make someone else understand who it is. So really, this idea of race isn't something that has a lot of weight to it, because you could have someone with the same genetics as me who has a phenotype that's different than me, right? You could have someone who maybe there's a family and they have a kid, it's multi-ethnic or biracial family, the parents are biracial, and they have a child, and that child, you have two children, right? And I think I've seen this, twins, and one twin had the phenotype that made the twin look white, and the other twin had a phenotype that made that twin look black. So they have very similar genetics, but they're just, the expression on the outside is different. Now, culture is a little different because culture is built around groups of people, right? And if you think about culture, I think has more of a significance in who a person is than race, because you can take someone of any race, you can stick them into the same situation, and you're probably going to get someone who comes out similar in those different situations. Culture covers things like the ideas people have. It covers things like traditions. It covers things like how people eat or the pace of their lives. For example, in the United States, one criticism of our culture is that people are way too busy. I actually think that people should try to live simpler, and they should try to get as much free time as they can so they can spend it with people they want to spend it with and build meaningful relationships. And they should give up the wealth they're trying to get and try to get the time so that they don't feel so stressed. So that's just one thing that I think is a negative aspect of American culture. And I'm sure that if you thought about it, you could probably point out things, and everybody has their different things that they have that they think that are bad about our culture, they think that are bad about other cultures. So when we look at the idea of culture, it's really just a group of people and how they live. And I think that when you look at culture and you have this question of whether we can write outside our culture, because I think that's probably the biggest difference I think that culture is probably the biggest difference between two people. I really do, because culture isn't just ideas. Culture determines paradigms oftentimes. So for example, a few hundred years ago, the paradigm in Europe and the United States, I guess, in the Americas with Europeans, was that Christianity was correct. So you have a base that people are building off of, and they're using that base to create ideas and build ideas, and that'll shape how they view things. It was different for the Native Americans in the United States. They had a different paradigm they were building off of, and every culture, if it's significantly far apart in its ideas, has different paradigms that it builds off. It has different ideas that are the basis of other ideas. That's what I'm trying to say there. So the Chinese have theirs, the Japanese, Russians have their paradigm, even Eastern European countries have their paradigm. So when you look at cultures, and you look at my friend's statement about how cultures really can't understand each other, when you look at two cultures that are extremely far apart, I would say that more Eastern, Southeast Asian cultures are further from like the American culture. So China is a culture that's fairly different than the United States culture because they were separated geographically. It's easy to say, oh, cultures can never understand each other. And I would say that to a certain degree, he's right. So you're looking and you're like, I just don't get that. Now, I don't think that maybe you can never understand, but maybe it takes more effort and it takes more time. And he did live in China for a while, and I think that he came away from China saying, well, I just don't get why you do things like this. I don't understand why your culture is like this. So maybe he has more knowledge to talk about this than me. But when you think about like cultures that are closer together, I think it's kind of the same thing, right? When you think about cultures that are closer to your culture, so for example, European culture is closer to United States culture than it is to Chinese culture, right? Let's go off of that even more. Western European culture is closer to American culture than Eastern European culture. And why is that the case? Well, it's because of the history of Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was under Soviet control for, I think it was around 40 years, from the end of the Second World War to 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. So you look at that, you're like, okay, those two are further apart, And then you're like, well, England is closer in culture to the United States than France because it was the United States was founded by English settlers. It took a lot of laws and ideas from England. It also speaks English. The United States speaks English as well as a dominant language. And you could even look inside the United States. So what I'm saying is that, okay, when you look at these different areas, certain cultures understand each other better. Maybe the reason why we get along so well with England is because they do speak English and we have a lot more connections and things related to them, so our music and information can flow better. But do we understand the English completely? Well, I would say that we probably don't understand the English completely. And I would say that even though we can get closer to understanding the English completely, that we can't completely understand them, at least not at this brief glance. Maybe if we lived with the English, maybe if we studied them for a long time, we could grasp what it is to be English and we could become English ourselves in a way, right? To a certain degree, we do take on a lot of characteristics of the English. So let's go a little bit further. I keep on using farther for this, but I'm thinking of it as a distance type of thing. So what about different states in the United States? I would say most people in the United States would agree that different states have different ways of doing things. I live in Wisconsin. Wisconsin does things significantly different than people in New York. Wisconsin even does things different than people in Michigan. We don't like people from Minnesota. We don't like people from Chicago because they drive crazy, because that's how you drive in Chicago. So there is a cultural difference. I would even say there's probably a cultural difference from city to city. And if you break it down even further, there's even a cultural difference from family to family. There is a significant difference between my family and my wife's family. My family says whatever they want. My family is just like, well, I'm just going to, if I think it, I'm going to say it. And we actually talk over each other. My wife hates this, but what happens when people get together in my family is everybody's yelling, right? Pretty much. Like if you came in and you're in a quiet family, we're essentially yelling. And what happens is someone is talking, and before that person ends talking, the next person starts talking, but they're having a conversation. So in my family, we talk over each other as we're having a conversation, but we're having a conversation. In my wife's family, they don't do that. She actually hates it when I talk over her, but they don't do that. And they're people who are less likely to write out what they're thinking. It takes a little bit more time to get that out of them. So there are differences, and can I completely understand what it is to be in that culture? And I would say that I can get pretty stinking close, right? I would say that I can get pretty stinking close, but it's going to take a while if I'm going to be able to understand them as if I grew up in that family. So I think that you can even extend this idea that my friend is talking about to different families. And I think that when you come across people that don't have a lot of similarities with you, this comes to the foreground, right? So if someone is in a really rich family, like my family isn't really rich, but if you have somebody from a lower class family and they're talking to someone who is upper class, there's specific ideas that are very different from those two families. If you think about even wealth, upper class people think of wealth as your connections, if I can remember that correctly. Middle class people, if you're middle class, you know what this is. They think of wealth or how to build wealth as hard work. They say, oh, if you work hard, you'll build wealth, and that's how it'll work. Lower class people view wealth as like, oh, we're going to buy a lot of possessions, and they put a lot of stock in their possessions. So from these three social classes, you already get different thoughts, right? So you could have people who are the same race. You could have people in the same town who have completely different thoughts. And that's why I break it down to these really, really small areas. One other big area that we could break it down is saying, oh, can a man write a woman? Because there are pretty significant differences between women and women's lives and men's lives. And if you look at how women interact, or generally if you look at how women interact, right, that women, at least from what I see, they interact with each other differently than how I interact with other men. So my wife, this is a little thing, my wife who, she doesn't actually think men can write women well. And I have a little bit of a theory on this, and I'll go into the other stuff quick, but I have a little theory on the idea of why men cannot write women well. It's because women are so complex, right? I think that men are simpler when it comes to things. I think that men are more straightforward. Like they see something, they say, well, here's the pathway to get there. And I think women, because they have bigger emotional centers in their brain. If you're not aware of that, women, I don't know if it's bigger, but I think it's denser at the very least. It may be bigger emotional centers. Also, women's corpus callosum, so there's a little center of your brain, the part that connects the two hemispheres, because your brain is split in half. The part that connects the two hemispheres of the brain together is bigger or thicker or denser in women. So there's more brain tissue in there. And so there's actually structural differences in a woman's brain in comparison to men's. And of course, there's differences in a woman's body as well, right? So my wife doesn't think that men can write women, and I'm guessing that men can't write women, first of all, is because men just don't have the capacity to understand, or generally don't have the capacity to understand social situations as well as women. Because if you have a larger social center of your brain, like the emotional center and the social center, and women are geared towards emotions more than men and socializing more than men, if you have that area of your brain and you have that way of functioning that is better than someone else's, you're going to be able to see a situation, you're going to be able to see more nuance. My wife's contention, or my wife's issue with men writing women, is they always make them seem weird. They always make them maybe seem too like men, or they always make them seem too stereotyped. Her idea is that they don't make them seem like real women. They're always these caricatures of women, or they're something beyond what a woman is, or not enough of what a woman is. So I think that's a really interesting thing. I think that maybe a lot of men who are writing, and I think this probably happens to science fiction writers more, because science fiction writers are generally not as focused on emotions and storytelling and they're more focused on ideas. So they're not worried about the social aspect of the story. They're more worried about conveying the ideas that they're putting into the story. So that would make a lot of sense, because you have a lot of these guys who are not socially focused. Let's call it that. They're not focused on the social aspect of the world. So they're not able to pick up those social aspects. So they're not able to actually convey what's going on. I just think men are simpler in their motivations and different things like that as well. And I think that because women are more social than men, their social interactions and how they interact with the world in general, not just their social interactions, but other areas of their world or other areas of how they interact are more complex as well. There's more going on there. And I'm not sure how that works exactly, but I do think that there is a difference. And I do think that that's probably the reason why men don't do as well writing women. And there certainly are men who are likely to write women very, very well. But I think that it's probably less likely that a man is able to write a woman well than a woman is able to write a man well, just because of what I talked about here, just because of the difference between their the social centers of the brain, essentially, and just the ability to communicate. Women generally score higher on levels of linguistic ability. So there's a linguistic aspect. There's a linguistic facet of IQ. I can't remember the specific word for discussing the specific areas, but there's a linguistic, you take the test and it measures it in different capacities. And I believe that women score higher in the linguistic area, like the verbal intelligence area. So they are able to talk about things better. And maybe it's because women just communicate more. Maybe women, when they're younger, they're so socially focused, and you can argue whether that's brain chemistry directly or whether it's socializing, but women are more socially focused generally. So maybe their brains grow better at doing that, because if you use your brain to do something, neural networks get created to do that thing more easily. So you can just decide on that yourself. But men, I think, score better in spatial intelligence, actually. So technically, men should be better drivers because they score better in spatial intelligence, but that's another thing altogether. So can anyone understand anyone? That's the question. Because if we bring this idea down to families, then you're thinking, wow, can I actually understand someone outside of my family even? And the answer is probably no. You probably can't understand someone outside of your family completely. And then if you ask the question, can I understand anyone else fully? The answer to that question is probably no. And then if you ask yourself, can I understand myself fully? The answer to the question is probably no, which is a really interesting thing. But what do you have left, though? So let's just say that you're left with yourself. Let's just say you can understand yourself fully. What are you left with then? You can navel gaze, and you can think about your own experience, and you can write on your own experience. Because if you have to understand somebody else fully to write about them, then you won't be able to. But if you can, there is a significant value in looking at your own experience and understanding yourself better and then writing on it, okay? But the question really is, should we write as other people? From my perspective, one of the most important jobs we do as creative people is we look outside ourselves. And I think there's two ways to do this. I think the first way isn't super controversial. I think the second way is getting controversial, right? The first way we do this is reaching for ideas and experiences beyond ourselves. We reach for things we don't fully understand. For example, I like reading a lot. I like philosophy a lot, and I don't get all of philosophy. I don't understand all of philosophy. I also like thinking about the meaning of life. I like thinking about why we're here and why we suffer, especially. If you deal with a lot of suffering, you think about that and you try to figure it out in your mind. So what I do, even though I can't understand certain things fully, is I reach out and I just try to get around it. I try to walk around the idea essentially, and try to get my mind around it. And I can't fully get my mind around it, but in some cases, I can kind of bring myself into that experience. And if I can bring myself into that idea or experience, let's extend it to both, I can write that idea or experience in a piece of art, right? I can think you can do this with music too, right? I think music does something else different, but as an artist, as a writer, let's go with that. As a writer, if I run into sadness, or I run into this deep struggle, I run into pain that I just can't fully get my mind around, I can't fully understand, I can still write about that pain. Maybe I'm just mimicking it. Maybe I'm making statements about the pain and what it is. Maybe I'm trying to compare it to something else, but I'm trying to understand it more fully, even though I can't understand it completely. People who do visual art, I think, approach this in a different way. They display it on a canvas, right? Or they display it in a statue, and I think it conveys that piece of the world, that experience that idea in a different way. And I think that musicians do this as well. And I think that musicians use direct sound. So I think it's like, I think music and writing is similar because you do deal with sound that people experience, right? Even if somebody's reading something, they have that little voice in their head, so they're dealing with sound. But with music, you're going to convey it in a different way because you're conveying it in the musical form. So all these things have a different way to do that. So that's kind of the first thing. That's the first way you're trying to reach outside yourself. And the second way is the issue of reaching for another person's perspective, right? So I think that to write fiction interestingly, you actually have to reach outside yourself for another's perspective. I think the sole job of actors is to reach outside themselves to get somebody else's perspective. So whether that is in their cultural group or not, they're still trying to reach outside themselves. There's a lot of actors who maybe they don't have the same experiences. Actually, the majority of actors do not have the same experiences of the role that they're going into. Now, some actors, and I don't think they actually get this experience by doing this. I think this is actually a fallacy to do this. The logic behind it is fallacious, but they assume that the method acting thing where they're like, well, I'm going to go get drunk to play a drunk character, or I'm going to do this to understand this character's plight. And honestly, you can't fully know who that person is because of the fact that you are not that person. And that person probably didn't fully know who that person was, honestly, because they can't see all aspects of themselves and they don't know how people see them. So they can't take that perspective. But I think that actors do that all the time. That's their job. They say, oh, this is a character. I'm trying to get into this character's head. And they do their best job of portraying the character. So from my perspective, it is good to write from the perspectives of people that are different than yourself. I really think it is a good thing. I think it's a good thing because it stretches your mind. And if you're being honest about that experience, now you certainly could be a jerk about it. You certainly could be someone who does not like that group of people. For example, if you really, really didn't like a specific ideology, you could write about that ideology. If you were on the political spectrum, so for whatever reason you're writing a book about politics, and you are someone who is a Republican, and you're writing about a Democrat. Well, what you could do is you could paint a straw man of that person. You could say, oh, this is how they are, and you're caricaturing who that person is, and you're not giving them any nuance. Or if you're really honest about the world and you're trying to make good art, because if you're caricaturing someone and you're trying to say it's good art, it's not good art unless you're intentionally making a parody. That's where it kind of splits. So if you're trying to be humorous and you're trying to create a parody of some situation and you're trying to be in some way honest about the parody, like there's a difference between, you can actually be dishonest in a parody. So if you look at a situation and you completely misunderstand it and you have a completely bad view of someone and you completely misunderstand their ideas and you create a parody, your parody is going to be a dishonest parody because it's not actually reflecting reality and it's not going to strike a chord because it's not connected to truth. A parody actually has to be connected to truth to be of any value. So to have a parody that's artistic and valuable, you actually have to go back to what I'm saying. You have to actually understand that perspective. You actually have to present that perspective in your mind as robust, and then you have to pick out a specific piece of truth in the world connected to that perspective or that person, and then you have to extend it in your parody, like you're blowing it out of proportion, but there is a grain of truth in what you're trying to say. But if there's no grain of truth, you're not going to get anywhere. But if you're doing good writing that's outside of the realm of parody, and you're trying to write something that's going to connect to people, or you're trying to write something that's real art, you actually have to understand, or honestly try to understand the person you're writing about, right? So that's why I think that if you're trying to do good art, and some people may be lying to themselves about doing good art, and they just say, oh, well, this person is like this, therefore I'm going to write them like this. Some people may be lying to themselves about that, but if you're actually trying to do good art, it requires that you actually try to get into the shoes of other people, right? And I think this extends beyond even writing. Like I said, actors is pretty simple. You're definitely trying to get into those shoes. You're trying to portray this character, as you understand them, because you're trying to portray them as you think they are, but it's really as you understand them. And then musicians, I think, do this as well in some cases. There's a musician I really like named Sufjan Stevens, who is a indie folk artist, and I believe he does this a lot. He gets into people's heads. He actually has a song about John Wayne Gacy, and if you don't know who that is, John Wayne Gacy was a killer in Chicago, in the area of Chicago. And he murdered tons of boys, like youth, males who are younger, not boys, I guess, like teenagers and stuff like that. But he wrote a song about this guy, and he said what he did. He said all the atrocities he did, but he did not present himself as not human, and he didn't even present him as a monster. So he's trying to like humanize this person who did all these awful things, which I think in the end is a really good thing, because it doesn't show... Because what we think, let's go to the monster thing for a second. What we think in our lives is that only someone who's a monster can commit atrocities, right? We make Hitler a monster. We are like, oh, Hitler is beyond human. Hitler is not human anymore. We shouldn't humanize Hitler. He's a monster. But the important part about saying that Hitler is human is to realize that people have potential for really, really evil things in themselves. Because if you say Hitler's a monster, you can completely write off what you're doing, right? If you say, oh, the Nazis and the German people were monsters, you can write them off and be like, well, I'm never going to fall into that. But if you say, whoa, these were real people, you're suddenly confronted with this idea that real people can be manipulated, and real people... Hitler, a real person, can be manipulated, and he can be changed. Things can happen in his life. Ideas can come into his life that completely change him from just a regular person to someone who's willing to destroy other people for his own gain and the gain of the German people, if you want to say that. But it's probably for his own gain. Very egotistical. And I think we also do that with probably serial killers. And serial killers lack empathy, but at the same time, I think they have a lot more in common with us than they don't. So I think that you should really seek to take on other people's perspectives as best as you're able to, and be honest about it, and research them and read their stuff. And maybe they don't even have a correct perspective of themselves, and you're allowed to critique other people. But I think you should do it in a way where you're not trying to just destroy them. And I think you should do it in a way where you're not just trying to make fun of people. And I think there is a time when you can make fun of people. I'm not saying that. But I think that when it gets down to understanding someone, like before you start to make fun of someone, I think you should understand them, right? Because if they do have really bad ideas, you should understand why they have those bad ideas and where they're coming from and all these different things. And you should never try to, I don't think you should ever try to just dehumanize someone, whoever they are. I think this is also something that can be a really big boon to your life. If you can understand people better, you can interact with them better, right? And understanding people better is empathy. Now, I don't think empathy is the end-all be-all in your life, but I think it's a good component. I don't remember who was talking about when they said this, but there was someone I know, or I was listening to someone somewhere, and they said that love is not the only virtue you need. Actually, I think I remember who it was now. But they were talking about love, and they're saying if you have only love, the virtue gets perverted. It changes into something bad. And I think that's the same thing with empathy when we're talking about it. You take empathy and you divorce it from other virtues, then suddenly empathy turns into something bad. It turns into enabling because you feel bad for somebody else and things like this. You pity somebody else. You're trying to do good for them, and instead of doing good for them, you're actually doing bad for them. But he was talking about love, and it's kind of the same idea. You love someone, and eventually you kind of give it all up, and you're enabling somebody rather than helping them. And he said that you need other virtues. You need truth when you're looking at somebody as well. So again, empathy isn't the end all be all, but I think that artists, people who do creative things, people who are trying to understand other people are in an awesome position. And I think we should understand that. I think we should take it very seriously, even when we're talking about making fun of someone or lampooning someone. We should take the idea that we are trying to understand someone else very seriously. Because we're going to be creating something, and what's going to happen is that's going to go into somebody's brain, and then somebody else is going to have that repeated in their mind in some form, and then it's maybe going to change their mind, and then maybe it's going to be a domino effect where it changes a lot of people's mind. Now, I'm not against comedy, and I'm not even against making fun of people. I have a good friend, and I make fun of him all the time. I'm pretty sure that every time I see him, I make fun of him. And I think one of the key components of comedy, which I think is an essential part to culture, actually, I think one of the key components of comedy is making fun of things. It's making fun of yourself in a lot of ways. I think a lot of comedians make fun of themselves, but I think it's also making fun of other people. I think you can do that. You can do it in a really cruel way, and you can do it in a way that is less cruel and it's more understanding of people. I generally think it's better to make fun of yourself because what you're doing is you're exposing your flaws, but everybody else knows they have similar flaws. So they're laughing at it because they have a connection there. All right, so that's what I've got. Our logical fallacy of the week is the ambiguous middle term. So if you can remember a long while back, I talked about the fallacy of equivocation. And now if you can't remember, the fallacy of equivocation is where you have one word that means two things. And what happens is the person who's equivocating uses that word in one way, and then they switch how they're using it later. People don't realize they're doing this, and I think most people feel backed into a corner, so they switch what they're talking about. But if they're actually going to talk about a specific thing, then they need to use the word in the same way they were using it before. So if I was talking about joy, and I was talking about joy in the happiness way, right? I was talking about it, I was making an argument, and then my friend started talking about it, and then he had a contention. And I'm like, no, I don't mean joy as happiness. Well, if I was talking about it like happiness in the first way, and I shifted it to not be happiness in the second situation, then I'm equivocating. This ambiguous middle term is a type of equivocation. It is, so if you know what a syllogism is, the most famous syllogism is Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. So there's three parts to it. There's two statements and then there's the conclusion. Socrates is a man is a statement, all men are mortal is a statement, and then Socrates is mortal is a statement as well. Now, if you're making an argument using that syllogism, or syllogistic a word, I have no idea if it's a word or not. If you're using that structure and you have a term in that middle statement that is ambiguous and people don't know what it is, or you never explain what it is, that is an ambiguous middle term, which is a form of equivocation, right? So when you're making arguments, make sure that you're actually stating what you mean by specific terms, and make sure you're not switching the meaning of those terms. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support me more, what I would ask you to do is that you go to iTunes and you leave a 5-star review. That is something that really, really helps me and helps push the podcast out to different people. And it's something that doesn't cost you much time at all. So if you would do that, I would really appreciate that. And I definitely appreciate everyone who listens to this podcast. If you ever listen to this podcast and you have questions or you have topics you would like me to cover, you can send those to me and I'll look them over and I'll see which ones I think I can cover intelligently. And if you just want to reach out for anything at all, you can do that as well. Thanks for your time. My name is Daniel Poppy, and as always, this is How to Write Good.